Look for the premiere of the movie Batman and Jesus, produced in collaboration with King's Tower Productions as part of Myth Information Conference 4 on September 30th, 2017. An audience for the Batman and Jesus movie premiere include Seth Andrews, creator and host of The Thinking Atheist, atheist celebrity Aaron Ra, mythicist scholar Dr. Richard Carrier, Naked Mormonism podcast creator and host Bryce Blankenagel, CEO of Atheist Republic Allie Jackson, and a slew of other guests. The Myth Information Conference will include the very exciting buzzed belief debate titled Islam in the Age of Trump between Asra Nomani and Faisal Saeed al-Muhtar that will be moderated by Matt Dillahunty. The conference will also include a lineup of speakers such as London-based YouTube juggernaut Sargon of Akkad, also YouTube sensations Armored Skeptic and Shoe on Head, and Global Humanist Secular Movement editor Melissa Chen. We will also be hosting a special VIP party where VIP ticket holders will be privy to a private presentation by Ron Miscavige, father of David Miscavige, the leader of Scientology, on his experience with Scientology during and after his escape. To learn more or to purchase tickets for Myth Information Conference 4, visit us at mythicistmilwaukee.com. Now, back to the show.
Welcome, everyone, to Myth Informed with your hosts, Brian and Dimitri. Today, we're once again speaking with our friend, esteemed scholar, and favorite mythicist, Richard Carrier. If you're new to the world of mythicism, this man is a must-follow. Author of many acclaimed books, such as On the History of Jesus, Hitler, Homer, Bible, Christ, and The Christian Delusion. Welcome, Richard.
Hi, glad to be here again.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You were one of our favorite guests, if not our favorite.
How about that?
That's very kind of you.
Right. We're finding out there's a lot going on in your world, and a new book, Science and Education in the Early Roman Empire. And you've got another one about to be released, available for pre-order. And so can you take us back? Tell me if I got everything right, and I want you to take us back in time. And one of the first questions I have is, before we get into like what science is, like Aristotle, you mentioned, kind of starts science, if you will. I'm paraphrasing heavily. What is science like before that? What's going on in the Egyptian Empire? You know, what predates like to Imhotep and folks like that? Like, can you give us a background?
Yeah, there's actually, for sure. There's actually two stages there, because really, like, the first scientist, and even the ancients acknowledged this, and we still do in our histories of science. Really, the first scientist proper was Thales, who wrote about 300 years before Aristotle. But what Aristotle did is he's the first to really give a proper systematization, to really make science into a formal field in a way. And all subsequent science goes through Aristotle. It's either repeating Aristotle or refuting Aristotle. Everybody's interacting with Aristotle. Mm-hmm. So that's the role that Aristotle played. He's kind of like the crystallizer of this idea of science, and making it more of a distinctive branch of philosophy. No, but there were scientists before him, Hippocrates and Thales and these others, Eudoxus and so on. There were some scientists doing some science before him, and it was sort of this trend that was growing up. And Thales was the first one to really set the thing in motion. And it's said that one of the things that he did is he figured out, like, one of the key revolutionary things he figured out is that the moon is reflecting the light of the sun.
Wow.
And a lot of people think like we just take that for granted, but that was like a big deal, because once you figure that out, you know a lot of shit, right? You know, oh, okay, so now the moon is up in here and the sun is over here, even though it's behind the earth. And so you've got a whole bunch of ideas about geometry once you've done that. And now he can explain lunar eclipses. The shadow of the earth is passing across the moon. This was a huge deal. Like this is the first time in history that someone figured that out. And so it was that kind of thing that sort of like opened people's eyes to doing science in the sense of the sort of empirical sense of figuring out how nature works, rather than just making shit up, right? Like sitting in the armchair and going, well, I think a lunar eclipse might be a dragon that eats the moon, like things that they make up. Thales started this idea of like figuring it out, using mathematics to figure things out, using empiricism to figure things out, trying to come up with hypotheses that you can test. and then look for ways that you can test that hypothesis, like all the things that we think of as science. So he really started that. Before Thales, there were scientists in a much more general sense, so astronomers especially and doctors. So, and then you had casual science. Like there's let's talk about like the Babylonians and the Egyptians. They had people who were charting the stars in the sense that they were like figuring out when certain stars would appear above the horizon, or when constellations, what it meant when a certain constellation was would appear in the sky at a certain time, and things like that. And the planets, they were documenting the planets, these wandering stars that didn't obey the rules of the other stars. So they were documenting these things and usually coming up with superstitious theories, religions, mythologies, astrology, and so on. But they were actually developing practical things, like being able to use the stars as a calendar, being able to use them as a clock, for example. So they're doing that kind of stuff. Doctors are starting to figure stuff out in terms of, this weed makes people's headaches go away, that kind of stuff. They're already doing surgery. They're doing that kind of. So it's not a formal science. It's like it's a craft at this point.
And can you ground us in
skills there?
What year are we in when you talk about the Egyptians, Babylonians, and then going into your book, which is early Roman Empire?
I haven't checked. Yeah, I haven't checked how far back these things go, but we have evidence, I'm pretty sure, of surgery, even brain surgery, going back at least to 3000 BC. And I think that some basic astronomy is being practiced around that time too. But in addition to that, and they're doing this sort of as a craft, right? It's not really a formal science yet. They're not like developing hypotheses and models and testing them against evidence. They're not doing science in that sense. But they're learning things about the world and documenting them and using that information to be able to predict things. And you got to realize, like, everybody's doing that in a more basic sense. So like you have farmers know how animals work, or they know how plants work. Like they're learning stuff just because they're using it and figuring it out, right? And so you have this sort of primitive zoology and botany going on. And people forget, like today, most people today in modern civilization don't grow up on a farm. We don't grow up without city lights blanking out the sky. But back then, like your average person knows way more astronomy than your average person today. Like your average illiterate hick in the hills knew more astronomy than your average person does today. Now, they knew less astrophysics, but they knew more astronomy. Like they could name more stars. They knew more about which stars would rise at certain times of the night and certain times of the seasons and so on. And they knew more about plants. They knew more about animals in terms of like, how do you cultivate corn or in their case, wheat? Or how do you take care of a cow when it's sick, those kinds of, these are things that are really scientific things, but they had this sort of craft knowledge, and they had a lot more of it back then than your average person does today. Now, your average person today has tons more scientific knowledge on other things. Like we know way more physics, we know more astrophysics, we know more physiology, even animal physiology. So our knowledge base has shifted towards things that we regard as more important now. And we learn tons more because we have universal literacy, and we have science education programs and so on. But back then, you got to realize that there was this primitive science going on, even in botany and in the biology fields, and in mineralogy and things like that. But it's with Thales and the Greeks that they start the process of doing rigorous science in a more modern like sense.
Right.
They're still mixing it up with some philosophy, some tabletop armchair philosophy. But they're still doing a lot of real experimental science as well. And it's Aristotle that really crystallizes this and says, hey, we got a method. We got to come up with a method, and we've really got to organize this into fields and so on. And then after Aristotle, science really takes off.
And you mentioned some fun facts. I don't know if it was in the book or we've just heard you mention these things, but I've got two examples here that really caught my eye. One is this whole idea about the fact that they were obsessed with perfect spheres and perfect circular orbits, and because they thought God was perfect, so everything must be a circle. And the other one being that, you talked about Ptolemy before, and the fact that his math was so much superior to Copernicus's, even though we know about Copernicus, no one knows about Ptolemy, at least those folks who just studied general astronomy in school.
Yeah, well, a lot of people know about Ptolemy, but only in one respect. It's the epicycles, right? People say, oh, it's just epicycles. And they're ragging, because it's a sort of joke that comes off of Ptolemy, which is unfortunate because Ptolemy's epicycles made total sense and were actually better than Copernicus's circles. But anyway, let's back up and go over what we're talking about now. No, this idea that God only makes things in circles was actually not a going thing in the ancient world. Plato liked circles, and he thought like the perfect mind would come up with them. But Plato was a shitty scientist, and all the scientists of the ancient world agreed Plato was a shitty scientist. So he's not really the standard to use. All the real astronomers of the time realized that reality is more complicated than that. And they were coming up with, they knew the planets didn't obey circular orbits. It just didn't work. There wasn't any way to do it. They tried it. And it started with Hipparchus, who was about like 200 years after Aristotle. Hipparchus was one of the greatest astronomers of the ancient world. He discovered a lot of really amazing things. He's the one who discovered the precession of the equinoxes, which a lot of people don't realize. You might have heard like the astrological signs are all out of order now, so that your astrology is all wrong. I don't know if you're into astrology. I'm sure you're not, but
I know my sign,
yeah,
things like that. But.
Richard, I'm a Libra, so you tell me.
You might not actually be, because the constellations have shifted. They shift every 2,500 years or so. And it's because the Earth is not just rotating, it's wobbling like a top. You know when you spin a top and it spins, but also has a secondary slow motion where the axis sort of rotates?
Right.
Do you know can you picture what I'm talking about?
100%.
Yes. So the Earth does that too. And its wobble, where the axis rotates, has a period of 26,000 years or so, and that shifts the locations of all the stars, but super slowly. Hipparchus figured that out. He actually got the time scale about right and everything, and was able to predict that the stars were shifting and that they were going to go in a complete circle, like the constellations were going to rotate completely around every 26,000 years.
That's really impressive.
This is an example of the kind of amazing shit that Hipparchus was doing.
Because the North Star is not always going to be the North Star. Fast forward 10,000 years and it's going to be Vega or something like that. Mm-hmm. And that's what he's figured out.
But
he's figured out that wobble is going on within a lifetime. Way back. That's impressive.
Yeah. No, and it's absolutely true. And so Hipparchus realized they had enough data by this point. They realized circles just don't work. So he came up with this idea of circles on circles, and then moving the circles, so having them eccentric, so that the circles are not directly centered. So for example, the moon is a good example. So because the moon actually is geocentric, people forget, the moon is actually orbiting the Earth. So geocentrism was actually correct for the moon. It's just not correct for the others. But they realized that the moon was, even if it was going in a circle, the Earth was not in the center of that circle. They realized the circle was shifted. So they call that an eccentricity, which is actually just one step closer to the correct view, which is that it's at the focus of an ellipse, right? So you just have a circle. If you just squish the circle, that's all you needed to do. So what they did is they shift it. So they realized it shifted. And then they said, well, okay, that still doesn't work. So we're going to say that the moon slowly rotates on this other circle while it's going on around the main circle. And that's called an epicycle, this sort of extra circle on a circle. And people make fun of that. But what they forget is that when you combine the two motions, you have one single motion that looks pretty much exactly like an ellipse. So they actually almost nailed the orbit of the moon. They just weren't using ellipses particularly. And then when you get to Ptolemy, he does this for all the planets and everything. And Hipparchus had already built out a system for doing it with all the planets and the sun and everything. And Ptolemy does this as well. And he perfected it to the point where he had about a 250-year accuracy. Like you could use Ptolemy's system, get a planetary position to within, I can't remember how many fingers widths, but pretty good, like within
3,
a finger
I
or
think,
two,
right?
Every 250 years, which is really fucking good if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so his system really worked really well. Now, when you read Ptolemy, we don't have Hipparchus. We only have people talking about what Hipparchus did. So we don't really know what Hipparchus specifically wrote. Ptolemy, we do. We have a lot of what he wrote. Not everything, but we have a lot of what he wrote. And we can read it, and we can see that what he's actually doing is he's describing the construction of an actual physical machine. He's describing how to build a computer that predicts the planetary motions. And so when you look at, when he's talking about epicycles, he's talking about gearing. And that's why he's using epicycles on circles. That's why he's not using ellipses, because he couldn't figure out how to build a machine that makes a planet move in an elliptical orbit. If you wanted to do that, you have to do it with combined circular motion. So you have to have this gears on gears, and you end up with this sort of planetarium that operates this way. So he's actually trying to replicate planetary motions on a machine.
Richard, was that the contraption they found in just off the coast of Greece that you end up talking about in a shipwreck? Was that because you talk about the fact that it was a primitive computer?
That's an earlier one, and that's not a planetarium. That's not an orrery. That's an actual No, that's an orrery, not an astrolabe. So there's a sort of a mechanical three-dimensional astrolabe, which is the kind of what we call a planetarium, where everything moves. You have actual physical planets moving around a sort of model of the Earth or the Sun or whatever. Mm-hmm. But no, the Antikythera mechanism, which is found off the island of Antikythera about the beginning of the 20th century, sank in a ship about 80 or 88 BC. It was built probably about 100 or 120 BC, this machine. And it does use that. It uses gears on gears to replicate the motions, but it doesn't have actual planets moving around. What it has is a dial readout that tells you the position of the planets and the sun and the moon in the zodiac. So it's actually, it looks like this really like cool ass, a bunch of, what do you call it? Needles going across a circle, showing where all the constellations are, and you can track the motion of the planets by turning a knob. It also showed the phase of the moon. It showed optimal eclipse dates, so dates when a lunar eclipse was possible, dates when a solar eclipse was possible, and it reconciled 4 different calendars of the time. So so if you wanted to know what date it was on 4 different calendars, you could figure it out.
Wow!
Using the machine, you just dial it to a particular date. You can check what that date would be in all those other calendars, and then you can check where the position of all the planets will be. You can check where the sun will be. You can check what phase the moon will be in, and all that stuff. And they did this all just with gears. So you just turn it, and all the gears work, and it does it. And it was pretty accurate. Reasonably accurate for the kind of technology they were dealing with.
Insane.
And so, that is a kind of machine that long predated Ptolemy. They were building that stuff. Archimedes was building those things. We know,
right, and
possibly Hipparchus had been doing as well. What Ptolemy's doing when he's describing the planetary system is he's describing. I mean, he also knew how to build those Antikythera machines as well, but he's describing an actual physical model of the solar system where you have the actual planets. You can watch them move around each other and stuff like that. So he's doing that point by point. So people should give more credit to what he's doing. It's pretty amazing, and he had legitimate. He didn't reject heliocentrism because of God or any stupid religious reason. He had legitimate physical reasons for thinking that heliocentrism didn't make sense. But there were other scientists of his time who disagreed with him and were arguing this point. We just don't get to read them because we hear about them, but we don't actually get to read their writings because the Christians didn't like them, so they didn't preserve their stuff. So there were these competitors. There were actually 3 different competing scientific camps about the solar system. One was Ptolemy's, which was that the Earth remains stationary and everything goes around it. The other was the heliocentrists, who were pretty much close to right. But in between, you had these dynamic geocentrists who believe that the Earth does spin, but it stays in the center. So they can explain all of the diurnal motion by the Earth spinning, and then all the other motions they do with epicycles and stuff as it all goes around the Earth. So there were actually 3 different theories of the solar system, not just the 2. It wasn't just geocentrism or heliocentrism. There were 3 different theories, and they are all plausible actually. And it would take time to figure out the physics of which one made sense. But so that's Ptolemy's doing that. Now you get to Copernicus, right? Copernicus, 12th, 13th century. And Copernicus doesn't like Ptolemy. It's too messy. Ptolemy also invented the first inconstant velocity law of the planets. He came up with the law: equal angles and equal times. So when you have the eccentricity of the circle and you draw an angle from, let's say the Earth is the center, the planets would go at different velocities and so they would pass through equal angles and equal times. Now, interestingly, Kepler, all he did was say equal areas in equal times. He just changed one thing in the planetary motion law that Ptolemy came up with. And so he turned it into an ellipse and did equal areas, and then he got the correct law of planetary motion.
All of a sudden, boom, genius.
That's like a chip in basketball.
But Copernicus is against all of this. God would never have the planets go at inconstant velocities. No, God would never have the planets be at eccentricities. No, the circles have to go exactly around the Earth, and they have to be exactly circles. Or exactly around the sun, sorry. So he's doing everything. So he's got one thing right. He's got the sun is at the center, but he's got everything else wrong. He's everything else is literally false. And consequently, by trying to force it into that sort of supernaturalist position of heliocentrism, his heliocentrism was less effective at predicting observations than Ptolemy's geocentrism, which is why people didn't like Copernicus. It's your system doesn't work. Ptolemy is getting observations better than you. Sorry. And that's the situation they were in. Now, when you have people like Kepler coming along and going, hold on, we can do a better heliocentrism if we take all the stuff that Copernicus rejected from Ptolemy and put it back in. and then we use ellipses instead of circles.
Right.
And those are just the two things Kepler did. And then Kepler nailed it. And then of course Galileo reads Kepler and goes, "Holy shit, this guy's got it." And then you have Galileo really pushing. Galileo is the Huxley to Kepler's Darwin, right? On terms of the heliocentric theory.
So I want to know that makes a lot of sense. Now, but you mentioned Aristotle is fundamental to this process kind of getting going, right? Is that much like you mentioned, Homer is kind of like the literary genius that everyone wants to emulate. Aristotle's kind of the scientific genius that everyone models their stuff after.
Correct. Yes. No, that's a spot on analogy. Even when they want to refute him, they're still doing it in an Aristotelian style.
Right. Okay. And Cicero, I think, like we're talking about education in the Greek and Roman Empire, like Cicero becomes huge, and everything that he's taught is like he presents and doesn't straw man. He steel mans the opposite argument and then makes his own argument. Is that correct?
Yeah, no, that's a good description of Cicero. People underappreciate Cicero as a philosopher. They think of him as a statesman and a politician, and his philosophy is just his side work. But he's actually a pretty decent philosopher. He didn't do a lot of original system building, but what he does is he talks about the philosophical debates of his period and his opinions in those subjects, and does a really good job of really carrying forward a lot of that information to us. Cicero was fond of the academy. It was sort of a skeptical branch of Platonism. It wasn't Platonism anymore. It was skepticism in the proper sense, capital S. So that they were highly skeptical. So they said, well, we're gonna not believe any conclusions. We're gonna say, hey, it could be any of these things unless you give us really good evidence. And so that kind of has a very scientific spirit to it. And Cicero is a part of that tradition.
I mean, would it be good for sometimes American universities or even high schools, our education, maybe get back to some of that learning, like point and counterpoint? I mean, what can you contrast kind of how we do things now versus how they did things then?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think like you wouldn't need more than one course on it. And it depends on what your goals for that course were, right? Like unless you're going to specialize in the subject. I mean, really, the thing that annoys me as a historian that people walk away from college or high school with a lot of false beliefs about what happened in the ancient world, and consequently, a lot of false beliefs about the role of Christianity in producing the modern world.
Right.
But that's just a question of how things happened and why they happened the way they did. If you just want to study physics, you really don't need to study Aristotle, for example. Or if you want to do biology or physiology, you don't need to study Galen.
True. But, I guess I was referring to more political theory. Like if you're going to, like when we have things in society that are a bit more divisive and you're going to try to counterpoint as opposed to straw man and crush the argument, it seems like Cicero's style would make sense. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to teach a way to how do you treat your opponent fairly. I think there are probably more modern examples you could use if you wanted to do that as a model. But I agree with the principle of teaching people how to steel man your opponents, because that's actually fundamental to science, right? The real big surprise, the secret to science that we figured out that sort of opened this box of stuff that we can figure shit out, is the objective is not to pick a theory and prove it true. Mm-hmm. That'll always lead you astray because you can always find shit to prove your theory true. Right. Mm-hmm. The secret to science is you try to prove your theory false. You do every damn thing you can to prove your theory false. And if you do the best possible shit you could do to prove your theory false, rather than doing the crappy shit, that's straw man argument, right? But if you do the best steel man shit, I'm going to try and really seriously prove my theory false. I'm going to find the best damn ways to do that. And then you fail. I mean, you fail to prove your theory false despite throwing all that shit at it. That's what makes your theory highly likely to be true. And that's actually how science works. Is science takes a theory and tries to poke holes in it, tries to refute it by every possible means, but ends up failing. And they go, you know what? We're just going to have to settle on it. This theory is true because, it survived all of these tests.
Or it's more
credible.
And
if you think about it, you look at the history of science, that's really what's going on in successful progress in science.
So, and that's a good point. Who's getting educated, like in the Greek and Roman system? Is this just the wealthy, the elite? Are women getting educated? Who has access to this knowledge?
Yeah. Now, of course, that brings us to my book that came out in October. Very affordable, short little book called Science Education in the Early Roman Empire, which is available now. And in that book, I actually survey the entire education system, so the whole thing. So if you're interested in education history, it's also a very useful book. And I cover things like what did the poor people know? How much were women? How much did women get access to this education system? I do all of that. But I also focus on the science content and even the science content of pop culture. Like today, like people learn science by watching TV shows or movies and stuff. Mm-hmm. And back then, there were the equivalents of those. There were public lectures, there were libraries, there were juries. You could get on a jury, and sometimes trials hinged on mathematical or scientific information. There were inscriptions, and then people could read them and then pass them on to people who were illiterate orally and so on. So all these other sort of pop culture ways, and through religion too. Religions love to borrow science that was convenient for it. Yeah. So there are a lot of these sort of popular ways that science would get to even illiterate people, but it would be hugely distorted by superstition and error and poppycock and things like that. In terms of who got formally educated, it was very definitely a small percentage of the public, probably no more than 10% of the population at the height of the Roman Empire. But these people, a lot of them would get a fairly decent science education by the standards of the time. You would get really good basics, and you would be able, from those basics, to learn more on your own through your own directed learning if you wanted to, or you could go find experts to go study under. And so, I documented all of that. What content was in there? What sorts of things were they learning? And how did people demarcate the education system? Were there universities? There actually were the full equivalent of universities under the Roman Empire. And so there are a lot of these different kinds of things. And that book covers it all. So if you really want to see that, and that's kind of important in the broader debate today, because you often get this Christian rhetoric where Christians invented everything. Christians invented universities. Right. Christians invented science education and all of this stuff. And it's not true at all. Actually, education was much better in the ancient world than it was in the Middle Ages. We had to recover that tradition. We had to rebuild it, rediscover it, and rebuild it. We had to really go back to paganism to get back on track and build modern culture. And the book, Science Education in the Early Roman Empire, really shows how that is. Like how what we did is we basically just went back to where they left off and then built on that. We really couldn't build on what the Christians were giving us. Mm-hmm. Right. And then that's just one piece, though, of a broader project. So where that came from, by the way, is that's literally chapter 3 of my Columbia University dissertation, smoothed out for average readers, but complete with all the citations and footnotes and everything. Mm-hmm. And what happened is in 2008, my dissertation was on basically the natural philosopher and the attitudes towards the natural philosopher in the early Roman Empire. Natural philosopher meaning scientist, that's the equivalent word. Yeah. And so 2008, but the economy collapsed then. There were freezes on hires. There were no jobs. So I went to my fans and said, hey, if you can help me pay down my student debt, I'll apply my Ph.D. to any subject you want. Everybody said Historicity of Jesus, so that sent me basically on a 6-year postdoc project of Historicity of Jesus, which really was like writing a second dissertation. But now, once that's all done, I finished it all in 2014. I started blowing the dust off my dissertation, and now I'm turning that into books. And I picked out the education chapter, turned that into a separate book. Yeah. But the rest I've put into the next book, which I've finished. I've very nearly finished. I've just got a few tiny touches to do before I turn in the manuscript. But it'll be out by the end of this year. It's already available for pre-order on Amazon for people who want it. And it's The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. And this is the picture, the story of who these people were. What did people think they do? What did they actually do? What progress was made in the sciences? What did the scientists and other elites think about science? Were they aware of scientific progress? Did they value scientific progress? Yeah. A lot of these different kinds of questions. And I have, basically this whole book is on that subject. And it's like Historicity of Jesus in the sense that if anyone who's listening to this has read or looked at on the Historicity of Jesus, you'll see that regardless of what you think of the hypothesis or the conclusion of the book, it's chock full of really cool, interesting background stories and history and context of the ancient world. And that's exactly what The Scientist in the early Roman Empire also is full of. It's like really fascinating stuff that you probably didn't even know that will interest you greatly. So I think people will find that book really fascinating, and I'm really proud of it. So I'm hoping to get that spun out by June 1st. We'll turn in the manuscript, and then we'll have that produced by the end of the year.
Mm-hmm. And if we bring back Christianity, how it had an impact on the age of science, you mentioned that Christians claim that they, it's the genesis of all scientific discovery, but you mention that the cultural end to science was Christianity. Essentially, once it took over, the culture changed, and to look at science, they started looking at science with suspicion. So we have, in the atheist community, we have this impression that Christianity was really actually a damper on that, on the scientific community. Can you give us a little synopsis of those contrasting values, the Judeo-Christian and the pagan/Roman culture, how they reacted to science?
Yeah, and it's important. This is important for any atheist listeners, is to distinguish, because Christians will pick the straw man. We've been talking about straw man and steel man here. Christians will pick the straw man and attack the view that Christianity was at war with science, which is actually not an accurate description of what happened. It wasn't that the Christians were at war with science. It's that they didn't like it and didn't care about it. And that's a somewhat different argument. It's not that they were like burning scientists at the stake. They were burning heretics at the stake, some of whom happened to be scientists. But that wasn't that they were going after the scientists. It was more that they didn't think science was worth the bother.
They
didn't have the values necessary to make progress in science. They loved inherited science. They loved using gospel science. Basically, they would treat the works of Galen and the works of Ptolemy as inviolable gospel that you can't progress from, and just use it and just believe it and just go with it rather than trying to question it or challenge it or fix it or improve it. But that's different. That's not doing science. And this is where we get to this core issue of it wasn't science itself that Christians had an issue with. It was the values necessary to actually realize and make progress in science as an enterprise. And the values are empiricism, which is this idea that evidence trumps all authority. And that's really scary to Christians, and had been back then, because that means the evidence can even trump the Bible, and you can't have that. Evidence can even trump your bishop. Well, you can't have that. Evidence can even trump your creed. Well, you can't have that. So this idea of authorities, your ultimate authority is evidence, and if you don't have the evidence to back it up, you can't believe it. That's the sort of fundamental, that's one of the three fundamental values of science. Christians are very suspicious of that because that attacked and threatened their entire hierarchy of social power and authority, which was invested in scripture, revelation, and people of authority, certain, your bishops and your pope and all of that. So Christians didn't like that. So they were very anti-empirical in that sense. They're very much anti the idea that empiricism should define your authorities in terms of what you believe. But even more than that, they really didn't like curiosity. And curiosity is another fundamental trait. You have to have, not only do you have to have curiosity as a virtue, you have to believe that it's a moral good to be curious and pursue your curiosity. Now, the pagans totally believed this. They thought, like, curiosity about how nature works, that's great. That's actually a virtue. This is totally cool. We like this. The Christians hated it because if you were curious, that meant you were questioning a lot. And if you're questioning a lot, you're going to become a heretic or you're going to challenge authority.
You're dangerous.
They didn't like that. Mm-hmm. So curiosity was even more suppressed as a virtue. There was this constant harangues against curiosity from very early on in Christian history, all throughout the Middle Ages. And when the scientific revolution eventually happened, it was very much against this hostility to curiosity. There had to be this really the few Christians who said, you know what, curiosity is actually a good idea, but the majority of Christians and certainly Christian authorities were against them. So they really had to argue for this rehabilitation of the value of curiosity.
Yeah, lest it undermines your position, because evidence trumps dogma, and it seems like what they're doing is the science that they do like, they're sort of converting into dogma and not really questioning.
Correct.
Not trying to build
absolutely.
on it.
Yeah, no, that's totally right. And then this idea of curiosity being fundamental, that drives science. If you don't have curiosity, you don't have science. You just have this sort of stale, this fossil of science. You don't have actual scientific progress, which gets us to the third value, which is this belief, not only – first of all, the belief that you can make progress in your understanding of nature, that there's actually scientific progress is possible. That's one thing. But you also have to believe that it's valuable, that it's worth pursuing. And the Christians hated both. They thought that actually it wasn't possible to make scientific progress, that if God didn't tell us he didn't want us to know, and then everything else is just conjecture. It's all contradictory. You can't make any progress in knowledge. And we have actual, and this will come out in my next book, The Scientist in the Early Roman Empire. I have a whole section, extensive quotations of these Christian authors saying exactly this, that nope, can't have progress in science. If God didn't want us to know it, or if God wanted us to know it, he would have told us. He didn't tell us, so there's nothing you can do.
What do they? How do they?
So they didn't value it either. They didn't think it was possible or valuable.
How do they?
And you
react?
can't have science, real science, if you don't believe in that.
But how do they react to some of the progressions that are clearly being made? I mean, the people are building on Aristotle. Archimedes is, I think, inventing the screw. There's advancements being made. Are they denying these, or are they just not talking about
it? Or killing the scientists, or putting them in jail?
They're not killing. They're not killing.
They don't have power yet, I don't think.
No. Well, first of all, in the first 3 centuries, Christians are not very well educated, so they don't even know most of this stuff. The ones that do know most of this stuff reject it as all ridiculous, or uninteresting or unimportant. So this is another thing. It's like they might recognize that it's there. I give an example of Hippolytus. Hippolytus is this early 3rd century Christian theologian who actually was an engineer, so he actually had a science education. But he writes about Ptolemy, and he says, well, all of this is ridiculous. It's all speculation. I can't believe anybody thinks he's a great astronomer. Why do we even bother? We can't know anything about the motions of the planets. And this is a guy who was educated as a scientist, and he's just throwing science under the bus, right? So this is the attitude that you're running into. So they were aware of it, but they weren't recognizing it as actual progress. They didn't see the distinction between valid science and invalid science. They saw it all as just a bunch of opinions that contradicted each other. They weren't able to handpick, pick out which things were actually supportable and which not, because they didn't put empiricism as the final priority. So if you don't have empiricism, you can't look at 2 different contradictory conclusions and figure out, oh, the one that has the most evidence is the one that's most likely true. That's fundamental empiricism. Christians rejected that. So therefore they were literally blind to the distinction between a theory that had good evidence for it and a theory that didn't. To them, they both looked equal. They just looked like, both those guys are just making shit up. I don't know. It's clearly just contradictory. You're not going to get anywhere with that. Mm-hmm. And so you had this sort of hostility, not to science as science, but this hostility to these fundamental values that are necessary for science to make progress. And that's what really killed
change.
It was, and it was the zeitgeist changed. The relocation of institutional support changed. The education system changed, and it all supported this Christian view that it's all about scripture, it's all about revelation, it's all about church authorities. Science is done. You can't make any more progress. Galen and Ptolemy, that's it. You can't go any beyond that. So we'll just listen to them. Some even rejected them, but some actually still respected them. And so that was actually, science got fossilized basically for 1,000 years, and there was no progress of any significant kind under Christian tenure. The Muslims made a little tiny bit of progress for about 200, 300 years, but they had the same thing where they had a religious revolution where the imam said, nope, science is evil, we're done with this, and science was shut down. And the opportunity, the Muslims had the opportunity to be 300 years ahead of us in the industrial and scientific revolutions. They could have been the world empire that defined everyone else. We would have been the fringe, third world section of the planet, had they not made that decision to kill science at that point in their history.
Right. It seems like it around 800 AD, Baghdad is the center of culture. They're translating all of the Greek texts that they can get their hands on, and they're translating it through many languages until it gets to Arabic, and then reproducing it. And I think that's how we still have some of our knowledge of some of these was retranslated. And I think it's Al-Ghazali is the Muslim scholar that now there's 2 Muslim scholars. There's a guy named Averroes and Al-Ghazali. One, Averroes is more Aristotelian, Al-Ghazali is not. And I think he wins out, and then they push them away from science. And I think Aquinas wholly borrows Averroes's the Aristotelian piece, and maybe that reinvigorates or at least opens the door again in say the 12th century for Catholics and the Christianity to embrace science. Am I right there, or am I reaching?
You're half right. So what Aquinas did is that he made Aristotle popular again. So people are like, oh, let's read this guy. Wow, this guy's amazing. This is incredible. The fucked up thing about that is that Aristotle was the beginner of science. But they think there was nothing after Aristotle, right? They think Aristotle, oh, that's the shit. but they had lost. I mean, even all of the other science after Aristotle, most of it had been lost completely. The stuff that hadn't been lost was still like super rare. Like there might be like one manuscript sitting in this rare this library in this monastery out in bumfuck whoever knows. And so most people don't know about all of this stuff. And it's only when the Byzantine Empire starts to collapse that you have these scientists in the Byzantine Empire start looting libraries and running west with these caches of scrolls and stuff and codexes and things, and then they're bringing them west, and some Muslim scholars were also bringing them west around this time, and then people started looking at this and go, holy crap, this is way more amazing than Aristotle. What the hell? And that's when you get the popularity of Ptolemy, and especially Galen becomes more popular at that point. But Ptolemy gets reintroduced. You get Heron of Alexandria gets introduced at this time, and various other scholars, and probably more than we even know. There's an interesting thread in all of this, and let me tell you a story because a lot of people don't know this. People valorize Galileo, but Galileo made mistakes. But he made one weird mistake, and one of which is his first book defending heliocentrism. He tried to prove heliocentrism by using what's called lunar solar tide theory, the fact that the moon and the sun are both responsible for explaining the tides. That if you can figure out the position of the moon and the sun, you can figure out where the tide will be. Amazing discovery. But he didn't discover it. This was actually discovered by the pupil of Aristarchus, the first heliocentrist, back in 200-300 BC, Seleucus of Seleucia. He actually figured out the lunar solar tide theory and wrote a book about lunar solar tide theory, and that became the standard. Everybody knew that the moon and the sun projected some sort of force that pulled the oceans up and or squished the oceans, one or the other, depending on their positions, and that this explained all the tides. So the ancients had figured this out. Now, Seleucia's book is lost. We don't have it. We have quotes of it. Okay. Intriguing, very fascinating quotes of it, and it really pisses me off that we don't have Seleucus's book. Which is a thing that happens to me a lot as a historian of science. There are like 50 books that we know existed in antiquity that it pisses me off that we don't have them now. But
it's like the 404 page, when that internet site is down.
So, one of the intriguing lines is in Plutarch wrote this book called On the Face That's in the Orb of the Moon. And half of it is mythology, but the other half of it is actual astrophysics, where he talks about leading debates in astronomy of his time, which is really interesting. And they're talking about theories of universal gravitation. They're talking about impetus theories. They're talking about, the debate between heliocentrism and geocentrism. They're talking about the debate between visual ray theory and actual like photon theory of light and like all of this stuff. So clearly showing that there's a lot more debate going on and a lot more interesting theories being bandied about than got preserved by the Christians in the Middle Ages. But he has this interesting throwaway line where he says, Aristarchus proposed the heliocentric hypothesis and Seleucus proved it. And that is a very intriguing statement. You're like, whoa, hold on. What do you mean Seleucus proved it? What does that mean? How did he prove it? But we knew that Seleucus did this lunar solar tide theory. So when you see Galileo, his first attempt to prove heliocentrism is with lunar solar tide theory. Mm-hmm. There's either two things happened. Either he read Plutarch and tried to follow the trail, the clues, the breadcrumbs, and figured Seleucus must have proved it with lunar solar tide theory. So he was convinced that must be able to do it. It can't. He's wrong. Galileo was wrong. It didn't work. But or Galileo actually had access to Seleucus's book. And that's entirely possible. There could have been a lot of books that were available to people like Galileo that just didn't survive the next few hundred years. And a classic example is the Archimedes Codex. And I don't know if you know the story of this sad tragedy in science history. There was only by about the 13th, 14th century, there were only 2 manuscripts left in the world of the works of Archimedes. Mm-hmm. One of them disappeared, so we have records of it existing, but it's gone. Mm-hmm. And then the other, by about like 1400 something, was sitting in this library in the Middle East, and these monks literally just took a pumice stone and scraped all the ink off and wrote hymns to God in it. Wow. So we get this hymnal. And then someone later, like early 20th century, looked at this hymnal and said, holy shit, underneath this text is scientific treatises by Archimedes. Mm-hmm. And so they tried to like reconstruct the text as best they could. But eventually, in the later 20th century, I think early 21st century, They took that book and put it into a particle accelerator at Stanford University and shot it with particle beams and used the cloud chamber computer to calculate the position of all the ink atoms in the manuscript.
Wow.
And they knew that where the ink was for the hymns, and so they told the computer, subtract all that ink, leave what's left. And so they were actually able to use a computer to reconstruct the lost treatises of Archimedes. And some of them are fragmentary. They're not the complete works of Archimedes, but we got a lot. We recovered a lot through this technology.
That's impressive.
But that tells you like how tenuous the survival of science was and how hard it was for anyone to even know that this shit existed. But if things like that could disappear, there could still be that's called a palimpsest, by the way, where you have someone scrapes the ink off and writes another text over it. We have lots of those. There could be more of them sitting in libraries today. There could be more lost treatises that maybe Galileo knew about. They could even still be surviving today somewhere sitting in libraries. No one's noticed that it's a palimpsest.
Or in a private collection. It seems like fossils often get stuck with private collectors before they can get to the academics.
Yeah. Totally true.
But you've been teaching us a bunch, and it's really interesting. I mean, I could go on like for at least another half an hour.
If only you were teaching a class
that
were available to the public.
I know that may have or may not have been advertised on your website at secularactivism.org.
Yeah, secularactivism.org has all my classes. Every month I do an online course. And it's study at your own pace, study as much or as little as you like. It's very affordable. And I do philosophy subjects and history subjects. So yeah, definitely check that out. Like at secularactivism.org, you can see the classes as they come up. And also I announce them on my blog. I announce them on Facebook and Twitter and things, so you can keep track there. And I do like about 8 classes, and I rotate through them over and over again. So I reteach every class. Eventually, I'm going to add an ancient science class when my next book comes out.
It just takes a while to make the PowerPoint, right?
What's that?
I said probably takes a while to make the PowerPoint for that. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in here.
I have several PowerPoints for that because I've been doing lectures on the ancient science stuff. I love lecturing about ancient science. I'm so glad when an organization wants me to come speak and then they pick sciences, my ancient sciences, to talk about, because I almost never get asked that. They usually ask, historicity of Jesus or religion or Jesus and, counter apologetics or something like that. But I love to talk about ancient science and ancient technology too, which is they overlap and are related. Yeah. I love talking about them. But anyway, in June, starting June 1, I'm going to be teaching a course. It'll be in philosophy this time, which is the science and philosophy of moral reasoning. And that's a really interesting example of how science has progressed so far, that we actually can start expanding scientific study into why people reason a certain way in the moral domain, and perhaps how they should be reasoning in the moral domain. And for people who are really fascinated by that subject or want to learn more about it, want to be better moral reasoners, or want to be able to answer these Christians who accuse atheists of having no moral foundation. You can't defend morality philosophically. What is the basis for your morality? If you want to be able to answer them really effectively, that's what my course will help you do. So people who are interested in that, you totally should check into that. You can register for it now. It starts June 1 on my website at richardcarrier.info. If you click on categories, on the margin, there's categories. Click classes, you'll see the class announcement. Or just go to secularactivism.org or the Secular Academy. You can Google that and do that, because you will find it very useful, very fascinating, very educational, just as much as what we've been talking about for the last half hour.
Yeah, I was going to say, those that have been listening, if this is if you're curious and if this is interesting to you, then taking a full course in this would be brilliant. And speaking of moral
and it's
reasoning,
super affordable. It's way more affordable than these like hundreds of dollars courses that colleges are offering. So,
and how does it work? Are you webcasting for a couple hours? I mean, how long does it go?
No, so there's no scheduled events. That's one of the advantages of it, is that you don't have to be on a schedule. You can do it at your own schedule. What it is there'll be readings, sometimes videos that you can watch at your own pace, but there'll be readings. There'll be a textbook. There'll be additional readings provided to you. And then I put on challenge questions that get you to thinking about the literature, and then we discuss those and so on. And that's how we learn about it. But also the big advantage of it is that you're going to read the readings, you're going to see the challenge questions, you're going to see the discussions with students and stuff. And even before you've seen all that, you're going to come with all these questions you have about this subject. How do you argue this point better? Or how does this work? Or what is the significance of what have we learned about the science of moral reasoning, and what does it tell us about these things? And you have a lot of questions, and so this gives you the full time to just ask questions of an expert. And because you're a paying student, you get my full attention, and I give you, detailed answers. You basically are buying my time, so you get a lot of it, as much of it as you want to take. And so that's one of the advantages of these courses, is that it's really a way to really pick the brain of someone who's really studied this and written peer-reviewed literature on it and things like that, and make progress on it, and then have these select things picked for you to read, so that so you can zero in on the things that are important to really get a good grounding in the subject.
So this would be kind of like coming into your office hours.
Yeah, totally. It's kind of like the good old days long ago when I used to do bulletin board debates and conversations with people and stuff, except it's much more collegial, it's much more educational. So it's really just sort of bulletin board conversations, but without trolls. And an actual expert who will actually answer your questions, right?
Richard, trolls are ubiquitous. You cannot escape them. Come on.
Totally. And then you get these good recommendations for these key articles to read. For the moral science one, for example, it's really important to me to pick materials that reflect reality, rather than armchair philosophy, but that really reflect the actual realities of moral decision making. And you might not have been exposed to those things. You might only have read about, for example, the typical, well, it's utilitarianism or it's Kantian deontology or whatever. Mm-hmm. No, there's a lot more to it than that. And so you'll get exposed to these additional ideas and additional knowledge, and you can work on that and build on that in the future.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you're going to cover this in one of your classes, but you just had an amazing blog post that was released today. This Christians didn't invent charity. So yeah. I don't know if you could speak to just some tidbits on that, because it's a brilliant read. I highly recommend that folks go and actually read the whole thing. But maybe, Richard, you can summarize some key points.
Yeah, glad to. Thank you for saying that, because I had been sitting on that for a long time, and I just think, isn't this boring, or does everybody already know this? Or
no,
whatever?
Not at all.
And I realized, no, not at all. Shit, I got to write this. So I totally did. And what prompted me is I've been slowly building. I've read Timothy Keller's The Reason for God, because everybody was telling me, this is the leading apologetics book now. And they're right. It's the #1 bestseller. It's outselling C.S. Lewis. It's outselling Josh McDowell. It's outselling Lee Strobel. So it is kind of now the book, I guess, that people are now handing to their friends and saying, this is why my religion is true. And so I'm building a full rebuttal to that. But as I do that, I realize that there's these side points that require whole blog posts of their own. And I've actually done a few already. My Bayesian counter-apologetics article, for those who haven't read that, you might find that fascinating, because it really nails the basic idea that Christian apologetics is all about concealing evidence. And when you put the evidence that they're concealing back in, their conclusions flip to the opposite. And if you want to see that for every single argument for God, I have 10 arguments for God, and I show that if you put the evidence that they're leaving out back in, the argument flips the other way and becomes an argument against God. And that's Bayesian counter-apologetics. And that I built that because I saw that was going to be relevant to the Keller article when I came out with it. But another one is, like, he had this thing about, mathematical beauty. So I wrote that article recently about this idea that the universe being mathematical proves God made it, which is ridiculous. But the other one another one of these is this idea that Christians invented charity, that paganism was they're just all these sort of ruthless, heartless people that never had charity or the idea of it. No, it's not at all true. In reality, like, they invented the modern concept of charity. Now, I'm sure charity existed in multiple cultures in all kinds of places. It may have all been around since the beginning of human civilization, for all I know. But
Richard, it was the Jews. Give us some credit. Come on.
Yeah. What the Greeks did is they came up. They really gave it a word and came up with this sort of philosophy of it that sort of established the reasons for why you should believe in charity and why it was important for civilization. Philanthropia. This is the word philanthropy comes from the Greeks, because they came up with this idea. And when you get to Aristotle, we talked about Aristotle as a scientist. He's also, like, primarily a philosopher, and he has probably one of the best moral theories of the ancient world. Some of the best writing on moral reasoning, which ties into my course in June. And he talks about it as virtue ethics, this idea that to live the good life, to be content with yourself and with your life, to be a happy person, you have to cultivate in yourself these moral virtues and live by them. And he has his own view of what these virtues should be, but one of them is generosity, which means charity. And he sees it as this broad virtue. There's a lot of different ways that you can enact charity, a lot of different priorities you can have in terms of how you enact your charity. But to him, it's fundamental to being a moral person is being a charitable person, being a generous person. And I write about that in my blog post for people who are interested in that. But this really gets picked up by other philosophers, and they really run with it. It becomes fundamental to Stoic reasoning, which became the fundamental philosophy of the majority of the Roman elite. Like the Roman Empire was kind of built on this philosophy of Stoicism, which came with this idea of philanthropy and generosity and charity. But of course, they were as imperfect in realizing it as the Christians were. You have the Christians, when they took power, they didn't implement the teachings of Jesus. They implemented fascism. Mm-hmm. So the Christians didn't, they would pay lip service to the teachings of Jesus, but really then they go and like burn people at the stake and enslave peasants and do all these horrible things, and maintain rich people and increase income disparity and do nothing to solve poverty and so on. So they had these ideals, but they didn't enact them. And the same could be said of the Romans. But the Romans did a little bit more to enact them than the Christians sometimes did.
You can take
but the
those...
Romans were also always more lip service than reality, especially Seneca himself. Seneca is one of these guys who promoted the belief in generosity and charity and stuff. But then he did some shady shit in business that led to wars and other bad things. So
you can very easily take those ideas to modern times, and the fact that the Christian right doesn't believe in single-payer healthcare, for example, and then you write about the fact that there's the social welfare system, and in antiquity it was free healthcare, and now we flip this on its head. So
yeah, it wasn't literally free. It was more like scaled fee, right? So you could have access to medical care predominantly if you lived in cities or near enough to cities to access medical care. And there were doctors you could access, scientifically educated doctors, who would charge you on a scaled fee based on your income. So like if you were poor, you would still have to pay, but it would be accessible. It wouldn't be outrageously beyond your means. And then, but there was also this idea that if someone who was absolutely destitute and couldn't pay, yeah, of course you should give them medical care for free. And so there was still this idea that there were people who could access medical care for free, but it wasn't as extensive as we could make it now, as we know for a fact, because Japan does it, the UK does it, Sweden does it, France does it, Germany does it, Canada does it, Mexico does it. Frickin' Mexico.
People forget.
As universal national health care. So the model of national healthcare today is way more advanced and way superior than what the Romans had. But they were at least heading in that direction. They had this idea of being charitable and trying to make medicine as available as possible. They really cared about this. They cared about subsidizing it. So emperors and cities and city councils would subsidize medical things. So like doctors' salaries would often be subsidized by the state, so that they could do this, so they could afford to take clients who were poor and couldn't support the doctor's salary. Well, the state would provide a huge chunk of the doctor's salary so that he could afford to do that. And so this kind of thinking, to see the Christian right being completely against it today is so much a betrayal of the fundamental values of earliest Christianity. It's even worse than medieval Christianity. I think medieval Christianity was more charitable medically than modern evangelical Christianity.
Yeah, albeit not as good, I imagine, when you're still working off the four humors.
Correct.
You got what you paid for.
Yeah. There was a variety of different qualities of scientific and non-scientific medicine you could get in the ancient world, and I'll give you some examples of this. They were much better at surgery than at pharmacology. But pharmacology, there was Riddle, Dr. Riddle, who's this professor who studied ancient pharmacology, one of the world's leading experts on ancient pharmacology. studied the pharmacology textbooks that have survived from the ancient world and looked at all of the stuff that they recommended in there and tested them all, or checked the literature to see if they'd already been tested, and figured out that about 20% of the drugs in the pharmacologies of the ancient world were effective. They actually did the things scientifically that they claim they did, which means the other 80% were placebos, right? So
and these were homeopathic, right? They weren't.
Yeah, well,
Herbs,
not
yeah.
literally homeopathic, but they were like homeopathic remedies where you just put a bunch of stuff together. Yeah, I'm going to mix 100 ingredients together, but it's 100 ingredients, so it's clearly way more powerful than like 2 ingredients. So you take this, it'll be great.
But you could have something that might reduce swelling. You know, that
One-
whatever
yeah, one
concoction that you've
Trust
done,
me, it'll
but
make you
and
feel
it
better in
works.
2
You're going to
days.
use it.
Yeah.
Obviously, you're not going to know
And
why.
just everybody feels better in 2 days, so it always works. Wow, that medicine is amazing.
But you could also drink snake oil, and I'm sure that would make you feel better if it changed your outlook on life. And it was mind
and
over
literal
matter.
snake oil was in the pharmacologies of antiquity. So,
Of course.
The surgeries are fascinating to me because I have seen like skulls that have been truffinated, where you've made a small burr hole in there, and they exhibit signs of healing. So they have actually lived, and I'm thinking, man, if you had some sort of hydrocephalus or like bad headaches, I can't imagine that would have worked. But yet they were doing it.
What it's good for is if you have a concussion, if you have internal brain hemorrhaging, the pressure of the
Relieves the
bleeding
pressure.
will kill you.
Yeah.
Unless you relieve the pressure. Now, so if you can cut a hole in the brain and let the blood out, and that reduces the pressure on the brain, and so you can actually survive that. Now, you could die from the bleeding.
Yeah.
Or you could die from the infection from the surgical incision into the brain. So you could die from these other things, but it's kind of like, like you have a 20% chance of dying from the procedure, but an 80% chance of dying if you don't have the procedure. So
Right.
both options suck, but the procedure is still better.
And would they were doing
And
things
so
like
that's the kind of-
epidural
and they were dealing with
hematomas?
that kind of reality a lot. In the
They
ancient
they
world.
were doing these for brain bleeds. They would because
Well,
you
no.
could do that, but holy
Yeah.
cow! I
Yeah.
mean,
well, those would be the people
infection
who
risk.
survived
There's
the
the
procedure.
whole.
Now we don't know. Like some of these might have been, pseudoscientific. Well, you're unlucky, so we need to cut into your brain. That'll solve your luck problem. Like there could have been shit like that. Like we
You're
don't
crazy,
always know
man.
the story, but we do have accounts from people like Galen. We're really lucky that Galen. We're lucky 2 reasons. Galen was a really chatty author, and 2, the Christians liked him. Thank goodness the Christians liked him because they preserved a lot of his books. About 200, I think. It was just about maybe about 100 books, something like that. A lot of books from Galen. Still not his entire corpus, but a lot of his stuff. And it's really chatty, so we get to learn a lot from him. And he writes about these surgeries that he attended or performed. And we get to hear these things, like he talks about this open heart surgery that was performed on a slave without anesthesia.
Oh boy.
With minimal they had a concept of antiseptics, but not a thorough science of hygiene in terms of like they didn't understand germ theory yet, so they weren't aware of how much they had to do, but they were aware that there was such a thing as infection, and that using like turpentine was more effective than just clean water, for example. But clean water was better than having nothing. So they're aware of some of these things. But you imagine this, and this slave survives this open heart surgery. So we have these discussions of like we have these descriptions of what they were doing and why they were doing it, and whether it was effective or not, and how whether someone survived or not. It's really fascinating. So they were very good at surgery, because surgery is much more straightforward. Like if you do anatomy really well, you do physiology really well, you can do better at surgery. You can make progress in your success at surgery. Pharmacology is harder because you have the placebo effect can fuck with you. And clearly it did, because 80% of their pharmacology was placebo. And so you have things like that kind of mixture of stuff in terms of medical successes and things, but like, bone setting they were really good at. And so there's a lot of things that they could do medically where ancient medicine mattered, where it would matter that you were talking to a scientifically trained doctor versus some priest of healing who prayed over you, right? Like that would make a difference to be treated by a scientific doctor.
Well, Richard, as with any conversation we have with you, we've gone into a fascinating area, which we didn't even imagine, and we love you for it. So I will just encourage all of the listeners to definitely read your blog, but not only your blog, the book that you have that was just released, the book that's coming out, your class. You're just a wellspring of knowledge, as usual. We love to have you on the show, and can't wait to have you back in the future. We will, I think, be seeing you at the conference in September.
right.
Is that correct? Perfect.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody should come to that conference. It's going to be amazing.
Yeah, we're excited, and if you end up presenting any material, we'll be sure to focus on the ancient science, which you said you don't get to talk about very often. So now we know that's really how we can ingratiate ourselves.
Right on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Richard.
Sure. You bet. Anytime.
All right, take care.
Thank you for listening to Myth Informed. Myth Informed is brought to you by Mythicist Milwaukee. Producer Sean Frasick, associate producers Fritz Blondon and Kristen Whitaker Hood, engineer Josh Benishek, technical consultant Jason Lawson, and hosts Brian, Dimitri, Jacob, and Joseph. Every week we produce a new podcast that sheds light on religion, secularism, and mythology. If you enjoy this show, please support us on Patreon at patreon.com/mythicist. Mythicist Milwaukee also brings major secular conferences and debates to the Milwaukee area, along with community events, both local and online. To support us in bringing future events, become a member at mythicistmilwaukee.com to receive member-only benefits. You can also visit mythicistmilwaukee.com and hit the donate button located at the bottom of each page to place a financial donation amount of your choice. And now, the closing theme, written and performed by Shelley Siegel.
There was a time when everyone believed Helios in the sun, Poseidon in the sea, Athena's wisdom and beauty, and Hades underneath, Isis of fertility, and ether of the Greeks. They all lie at rest, and who will be the next to die? You know they are all myths, and who will be the next to die? There was a time when everyone believed Helios in the sun, Poseidon in the sea, Athena's wisdom and beauty, and Hades underneath, Isis of fertility, and ether of the Greeks. They all lie at rest, and who will be the next to die? You know they are all myths, and who will be the next?